on the group analyst's function, person, and training. In previous talks, we have spoken off and on of the group psychotherapist or conductor and his function. On this occasion, we shall consider in greater detail what he should be, what he should know, and what he should or should not do. I have said that he acts as a dynamic administrator, as an interpreter and analyst, and that he is altogether the most decisive, influential factor as to the culture which develops in the group, its whole prevailing atmosphere. In this last respect, it is his personality which is of decisive importance. Inevitably, he also acts as a model, and his style of doing things is very significant. We have said that the conductor does not lead the group, as he is not concerned with having a good, well-functioning, effective group in the usual sense of the term. Inevitably, however, his is the ultimate decision on all vital aspects, on who is admitted, in which way a group is composed, who is to leave the group and when, and all the implied rules of conduct, as well as the conditions which he sets up. The way in which he does this is important, namely that he takes into account the symbolic meaning of all these factors, that he expects them to be freely discussed in the group, notwithstanding that his is the ultimate responsibility. The conductor genuinely gives the group to understand that their opinions, their feelings and proposals are worthy of serious consideration and may be given effect in the group procedures. Where this is not possible, it gives him a valuable opportunity to make the group see why certain procedures are not recommendable or even harmful. It is in this sense that the conductor directs the group all the time. Yet it is equally true that he must be fully aware of the fact that he is himself part of the group, and that his direction is not merely in the interest of the group, of the patients, and not in his own, so that he himself, to modify the saying of Frederick the Great of Prussia, is the first servant of the group. In one word, he makes the group the instrument of its own therapy, while he considers himself to be an instrument of the group. When choosing the term conductor, there were many reasons into which I need not go here. One of them, namely the musical connotation, inviting comparison with the conductor of an orchestra, was not unintentional. Yet it should not be overemphasized. It originally arose because I felt like a conductor of an orchestra who does not know what music is being played beforehand and who has no score. Moreover, the orchestra, the patients, do not know what they are going to play either. Yet he still means to make sense of what happens. I mention this here because the therapist conductor is a kind of interpreter in the same sense. And as can be seen from this example, he has in fact to create sense. He's almost like a composer at the same time. Therefore, he has, in the first place, to follow and try and understand what is the group saying, what are they doing, what is it all about. He has, in this sense, rather than in the usual technical sense, to interpret what is going on in the first place. Let us now consider some of the important functions the conductor has as administrator before the group ever meets. In the first place, I will assume that he creates a group newly. There are, of course, conditions which are set, like time and frequency of meeting, the place, the room, the seating arrangements, the various restrictions, in particular the one of not creating friendly outside relationships while treatment is going on, the question of fees, a very important one, discretion, and so forth. These and other similar requirements must be made clear to the patient, and he must agree with them. But as far as ever possible, they are not introduced as rules which must be kept, but by pointing out the meaning of any irregularity when it occurs. First of all, by taking it up, and secondly, by showing its significance. This method has various advantages in making the group understand why these restrictions are necessary, in also demonstrating that any such behavior is there for consideration, analyzing, interpreting. In short, is treated as a communication which can and will be taken up. This naturally applies also to such simple communications as being late, missing sessions, and similar irregularities. The conductor, having in the beginning probably taken a more active part in this, will find that if he acts on these lines of the group analyst, as here understood, that gradually and very soon the group becomes a very active and attentive body and analyzes in many respects the behavior of its members, of each other, and of themselves in their own person. Now a word or two on indication. Whom do we select for such treatment? Let me first of all say that group analytic psychotherapy is a valuable experience for anyone. One might say that the only people for whom it is not indicated or contraindicated are those who are too sick or too normal, by which I mean too strongly defended and rigid. Well, those will usually find good reason to keep away anyhow. In principle, it would be very valuable for them if and when their rigid defenses and prejudices can be at least somewhat liquidated, and we can become more fully living persons. One can say this from occasional examples of people who tumble into such group almost accidentally. As we, however, are in the first place concerned with patients, that is, with persons who look for help in calamities, there is, of course, an overlap with any psychotherapy, especially of an analytic kind, and also with psychoanalysis in indication. But I would say that group analysis or similarly intensive group psychotherapy should be the indication of preference, and that individual treatment is indicated only when there are specific and special reasons for this, or against the group. Group analytic psychotherapy is very useful in all forms of psychoneuroses, especially in neurotic failure, lack of success or competence, social and sexual inhibitions, anxiety states, phobias, character and personality disturbances, conditions of derealization and depersonalization, including lack of personal identity and confidence. Even schizophrenic conditions, when not too acute, and lighter forms of depression, and even of paranoid reactions, as well as psychosomatic diseases, mix well with groups composed predominantly of neurotic patients to their mutual benefit. The same can be true for some forms of perversion, for instance homosexuality, fetishism, transvestites, though they are on the whole better treated in special problem groups of their own, as are delinquents, psychopaths, addicts, and more acute psychotic conditions. Generally favorable points are good intelligence, not to be overrated, good personality assets, good motivation for a more radical approach rather than mere alleviation of symptoms, for acceptance of longer duration of treatment and tolerance for temporary frustrations. The selection can be done, even preferably, in the group situation itself. I found that seeing about 5 patients together whom I'd never seen before, and having a good talk with them in which they participated, and if possibly began to interact, I could form a very good picture in a dynamic way of their behavior and of the way in which they could be expected to react to treatment in a therapeutic group. As to the question of composition of groups, the diagnostic label is altogether of much less importance than the basic compatibility, to some extent, in such factors as class, intelligence, education, work of life, and so forth. This itself seems to me a very significant finding. Where differences are too great in one of these categories, this can be neutralized to some extent by greater uniformity in others. For argument's sake, a greater difference in education does not matter as much where the intelligence is high, and so forth. But nevertheless, a certain common ground, though not at all in a narrow sense, is very desirable, and, most important, no one should be isolated in any decisive aspect if this can be avoided. I have found that in order to put together a new group of 8 patients, I would need about 12 already selected ones as a basis. I would then set out on a grid the important factors about these 12 candidates, and from this I could, on paper, very well form a group of 8. For technical details, I must refer you to my writings, especially therapeutic group analysis. When they met in vivo, it might turn out that one of them was after all not well placed in this group, and he might have to be replaced straight away by a reserve candidate, as it were. In the case of slow open groups, putting together a new group is not a frequent occurrence. As I have already said, the individual patient needs to be told very little by way of preparation. He will find most of it established as a living tradition in the group which he joins. It is unnecessary when introducing a new member, who has of course been already found suitable for the vacancy he is to fill, to tell this newcomer in detail what to expect. He can confidently be left to find this out for himself in his own group experience. He must, of course, be given the necessary factual information and agree with these conditions. As to the rest, he should be allowed to ask questions, as he is often bewildered and anxious, and he should be given reasonable answers in a reassuring sense. As in any other consultative interview, the main point is to get as dynamic a picture as is possible of the patient, of his motivation, his capacity for understanding, his capacity of making use of tentative, very cautious interpretations he is given. The factual information about the patient, which is very important, is best obtained beforehand, either by questionnaire or someone else's preliminary interview, possibly also with the use of tests. This factual information is important in order to construe a dynamic profile and to help focus the initial interview on the most relevant points, dynamically speaking. If we ask ourselves two important questions. First, what sort of personality do we think is most suited to this type of work? And, provided we are satisfied about personal attributes, what sort of training is required? Or, on the other hand, optimally indicated for the group analyst. Now, as to personality, I would not like to lay down the law. It is relatively easy to say that the therapist should be experienced in this work, that he should be a person who deserves the confidence that his patients put into him, a person who is not grinding his own axe, who is open-minded, interested in people without wanting to shape these people according to his own ideas, that he should not be a rigid obsessional type. Above all, I would say that he should not have lost his own creative ability, but at the same time be able to be a very good listener, to take in what other people really are saying, what really are their values, rather than what in his opinion their values should be. The latter capacity of being a good listener is very important indeed. It can easily be underrated what this implies. To my mind, it does imply a special capacity to take in what comes, to receive without prematurely passing any kind of judgment or any kind of interpretation on this. This capacity to be open-minded to the extent of letting oneself be lost and bewildered rather than to try and control what is going on is very important, particularly for the group analytic psychotherapist. Having said all this, I still do not envisage ourselves setting up some kind of tribunal or court of judgment and examining the candidate as to these qualities. What is more to the point is that we exclude or discourage those types of people who in one way or another definitely fall short of the above-named qualities or even have contradicting character development. In other words, it would be more to the point to have a selection committee in order to keep out unsuitable candidates rather than to examine people as to their positive qualities. There must be very different personalities capable of being trained to be successful and competent group analysts. It is true that their personal style will inevitably vary according to their different personalities, but they should agree on common principles. Unless they do so, they will not find much possibility of learning from each other's experiences. In fact, of teaching and training, nor, and equally important, from theoretical developments and even simple observations. It is possible for different personalities to become efficient and still adhere to the same basic principles. Now, training and experience can be roughly divided into two different parts. The one which applies to group psychotherapists in general, the second to the group analyst in particular. All group psychotherapists need sound psychiatric and psychotherapeutic experience. The novice should go through a course which provides fundamental guidelines and a theoretical framework. If at all possible, he should undergo group treatment himself. Then he should sit in with an experienced group psychotherapist and should not do any independent work until he has acquired a desirable degree of experience under supervision. These general foundations also hold good for the future group analyst in the more specific sense. However, the analytical part of his training, the analytical aspect, which has to be combined in the group analyst with a general fund of experience with such groups, demands special consideration. The most desirable background for him is to have undergone group analysis as well as psychoanalysis in his own person. If he is a well-trained and experienced psychoanalyst already, so much the better. If he is not, his personal group analytic experience is more fundamental. This, where necessary, may be followed rather than anteceded by a personal psychoanalysis. the future group analyst should have at least 2 years of experience as a patient without any other qualification, with as good a group analyst as he can find. I have found that those who have this experience, though not that of an individual psychoanalysis, are more at home analytically within groups than those who have had a psychoanalytical experience but never a group analytical experience. This may sound surprising, but it is my considered opinion on the basis of long experience and watching the after effects in patients and therapists alike. Dealing with the individual in the group is very different from doing so in the psychoanalytical situation. Therefore, the man who has the otherwise so desirable psychoanalytical training is not per se qualified to be a group analyst. He has the great advantage of understanding unconscious fantasy, unconscious meaning, the unconscious interpretation by the patient of the therapist's own position, of his power, his omnipotence, as well as his enormously feared power of destruction. In short, the positive and negative task zones from the inside. This is a great point in favor of psychoanalytical training. It is not so often considered what the drawbacks are of such previous training. Briefly, they are that psychoanalysts tend to look upon the group of patients as if they could as nearly as possible analyze them one after the other in public hearing, as it were, or that they transfer too readily concepts from psychoanalysis to this new field when unprejudiced observation shows that they operate in different ways. This refers, amongst other things, to the important example of transference phenomena themselves. On the other hand, I do not think that there are two disciplines which have to be married in the group analyst, that of the psychoanalyst and that of the group dynamicists. I think it is a field in its own right and possible to study in its own right without any loans from any other field. The great difference between us and the group dynamicists, apart from many others, is that we attach considerable importance to unconscious processes and to the unconscious meaning of what we observe. If we describe what is going on, and if we observe what we can, we find that we have to base our observations on a different ground and use concepts which do not so much stress the inside psychology of the person and the outside interaction or transaction, but that they are one and the same act. The processes which are usually considered to be internal to the person, intrapsychic, are in fact shareable and have a communal ground called matrix in our type of group. To sum up, what I have said so far should lead to a relatively clear idea of what selection and training implies for the future group analyst. In short, undergoing of a group analytical experience fully in his own person, and, if possible, supplemented by an individual psychoanalytic experience, preferably not at the same time. If individual psychoanalysis follows, as it should, the analyst should preferably be another person than the group analyst was. Sitting in with a competent group analytic conductor for another year or two is important. This may possibly overlap with at least the first two groups which the novice conducts and which should be under supervision. Supervision itself can best be done in a small group, in a situation in which the candidates themselves take an active part. In this supervisory process, they look very much also at their own motivations as conductors. For example, interventions or other participation for reasons of their own rather than that of the group. These motivations can be quite conscious, or they can be and often are largely unconscious and are even strongly defended against. This type of analytical work in supervisory groups is therefore in turn a most important therapeutic experience. In my own opinion, people could, without being ashamed of this, continue meeting in such small groups, which would give them a lot of opportunity to learn from each other and a lot of inner compensation and support for the manifold strains of this profession. This latter idea applies also, to my mind, to psychoanalysts, and I'm sorry that it has not yet been used, insofar as I know, in analytical circles, so as to supplement or to partly replace the repeated personal psychoanalysis recommended eventually by Freud and others. These repeated analyses, in any case, have problems of their own. Besides the essential part of learning to become a group analyst, as I've just described, theoretical and other instructions are required. To some extent, this can be conveyed by group discussions and seminars. The intensive study of the most essential psychoanalytical and group analytical literature is absolutely necessary. This knowledge ought so much to become part of the person that he does not have to think how to apply it, but it becomes a part of his own personal equipment. Notwithstanding this, there are certain basic anxieties to which the therapist facing such groups is liable. He shares with the members of the group certain fantasy expectations, especially that the ultimate should be omniscient, omnipotent, and in every respect perfect. He is the bearer of the qualities ascribed to the different gods in the different religions. He shares this unconsciously with the group. If he has been well group analyzed, he should have learned to accept himself and his life as a matter of his own responsibility, and to have no need and not to need the protection of the almighty parental figures to support him. Now, because he shares this, he feels the lack of these qualities within himself, being an ordinary, poor human being, and the contrast is one of the reasons which cause his irrational anxiety. Actually, the experience of being a group analyst ought itself to be a constant stimulus of a therapeutic kind for the psychotherapist. This is very different from saying that he should use the group in any way for his own treatment. The therapeutic effect on the patient and that on the therapist are of a different order. While the group analyst treats the members of his group as what they should be and what they are, grown up, reasonable, intelligent people with responsible positions in life, as a rule, he must never forget that at the same time, at the opposite pole, his role is totally imaginary, that of an omnipotent, omniscient God, an all-powerful devil, that all his actions and all what he says have magical significance. I cannot go into more detail into what to do about this and how to reconcile these two functions, but must refer those interested to my writings, especially my book, Therapeutic Group Analysis. Here I can only shortly remind you that in the analytic approach, the conductor is constantly alert to unconscious significance, which he only cautiously voices, always starting from the manifest surface of observable events, and that through this analytic attitude he thus introduces, the group develops a culture in which deep psychological reality is shared. I have mentioned that the conductor himself takes his orientation as to what level or levels are operative in the group at any given time by the phenomenon of resonance. The therapist must keep the irrational, the magical effects of his instructions to the group constantly in mind. If, for instance, he has given them to understand that they should not meet outside the group sessions, that they should avoid talking to each other about the group, so far as this is reasonable to expect, that they should keep group matters as discreet and confidential as is feasible. The irrational psychological consequences of this are enormous. This brings me to a word about discretion. One should not overstress this claim. In the case of married people, for instance, it would be nonsensical to demand that the spouse hears nothing, that the group is never talked about between them. The intimate current network in which the patient moves is indeed bound to be, to some extent, affected. One's aim is that such extra-sessional experiences should come back to the group, as one is dependent on this. Nevertheless, the spilling over into the current network while treatment is going on should be kept at a moderate level. It is quite possible to achieve this with all patients, unless they are too severely disturbed. Any ongoing other treatment for existing or suspected diseases or examinations must obviously be left to other doctors. If there is good contact over this between the group analyst and the other doctor, or a lawyer, or whoever it might be, so much the better. But it is also possible to treat such events entirely within their psychological context of both the individual as well as the group, and leave the external events to take their own course. The therapist's more active and direct participation in the process is especially marked when starting a new group, or, better perhaps, in the initial phase of the group, which for certain reasons I would roughly consider to be the first 6 sessions. Other occasions when the conductor might intervene more actively are the introduction of a new member, the preparation of the group for this, choosing the right moment at which to introduce the newcomer, etc. Whenever possible, the conductor keeps back with his own intervention. Keep them to a minimum, so that the group can become used to the fact that tua res agitur, that it is their business which is at stake, that it is their task to make every effort to contribute to the solution of the presenting problems. Soon enough, the group makes the experience, a very important experience, that selfish personal interests and the interests of the therapeutic group, ultimately the community as a whole, need not be antagonistic, but go in fact together, at least to a large extent. A deep change of attitude is necessary for the realization of this ultimate interdependence of individual and group, also of conductor and group, of leader and group. It is not a question of superficial adaptation or socialization. It is a question of the reorientation of the total relationship of the individual to his community or nation or humanity as a whole. With some optimism, we may assume this to be concurrent with the most important need and objects of this period of human history.